"Sir, I can make your daughter walk again." The wind cut through the winter dusk like broken glass, scattering dry leaves across the marble steps of the St. Thomas Memorial Hospital. Richard Hensley's footsteps echoed sharply against the stone, a rhythm of power, wealth, and unbearable grief. The billionaire whose signature could shift markets and ruin empires was now walking like a man dragging invisible chains. And just as he reached for the door of his waiting limousine, a frail, dirt-covered boy stepped out of the shadows and said, in a voice too calm to be ordinary, "Sir, I can make your daughter walk again." Richard froze. The world around him went utterly still. The honking cars, the hum of traffic, the distant wail of an ambulance. Everything folded into silence. For a heartbeat, he thought he'd misheard, but the boy stood there, small and barefoot on the icy pavement, his eyes bright as if holding fire inside them. "What did you just say?" Richard's voice came out low, dangerous, the tone of a man who'd been approached by 100 frauds and blackmailers before. The boy didn't flinch. "Your daughter," he said softly. "She hasn't walked in 3 years. But I can help her." The billionaire's jaw tightened. "Who told you that?" "Who the hell are you?" "I'm just someone who can fix what's broken," the boy replied, his tone steady, almost eerily adult. For a long moment, Richard just stared at him. He noticed the boy's trembling hands, his torn shirt, his thin frame, but also the strange stillness in his gaze, like someone who had seen too much pain and learned to stop fearing it. Something about those eyes stirred a feeling Richard hadn't known in years. Unease. "Get in the car?" he said finally, more out of curiosity than belief. His driver looked startled but obeyed, opening the rear door. The boy shook his head. "No need, sir. I'll be right here when you're ready to listen." And with that, he turned and disappeared into the alley behind the hospital, leaving only his words behind. Words that burned into Richard's mind long after the limousine had pulled away. Inside the car, Richard's reflection glared back at him through the tinted glass. Every night for 3 years he had driven away from that same hospital after watching his daughter, Emily, lie motionless on that sterile white bed. 3 years since the accident, the one that took his wife and shattered Emily's spine. 3 years since he'd stood beside her and promised her she'd walk again. But no doctor, no surgeon, no therapy in the world had been able to keep that promise. He told himself he didn't believe in miracles, yet that boy's voice echoed like a curse. "Sir, I can make your daughter walk again." How could a street beggar possibly know about Emily? He had kept the tragedy out of the public eye. Not even his closest business partners knew the extent of it. Only the hospital staff and a handful of confidants. He stared at the city lights flickering by the window, every glow reflecting his emptiness. Once he'd believed money could buy anything, power, control, even forgiveness. But it couldn't buy back the laughter of a child who used to run barefoot in their garden, while her mother played the piano by the porch. Now the house was silent, and his wealth felt like an insult to everything he'd lost. As the limousine rolled through the gates of his mansion, Richard's mind replayed the image of that boy. The calmness, the confidence, the strange light in his eyes. It wasn't just a scammer's boldness. There was something else there, something that felt like recognition. He tried to shake it off. He poured himself a glass of bourbon and stood by the window overlooking the frozen garden. The glass trembled in his hand as the memory of his wife's last words came back, the ones whispered through broken breath on that rain-slick highway. "Take care of her, Richard. Promise me." And he had promised, but failed. He pressed his fingers to his eyes, exhaustion biting through him, when a sound from outside made him turn sharply. Tires screeched on the driveway. His driver was back and alone. Richard stepped out onto the porch. "Why are you back?" The driver hesitated. "Sir, that boy. He's sitting at the front gate. Says he won't leave until you talk to him." Richard's heart gave a dull, painful thud. He didn't know why, but part of him didn't want to go out there. And yet he did. The boy sat cross-legged beside the gate, snow dusting his shoulders, his hands cupped around a tiny candle that flickered weakly against the wind. When Richard approached, the boy looked up and said quietly, "I told you, sir. I can help her. But you have to promise not to ask how I know." The candle flame flared suddenly, lighting the boy's face fully. And for the briefest second, Richard's breath caught. There was something hauntingly familiar about that face. Before he could speak, the boy stood and whispered, You'll come tomorrow. You won't be able to stop yourself. Then, without another word, he blew out the candle and vanished into the night, leaving Richard standing alone beneath the falling snow, his pulse hammering, his heart caught between disbelief and the cold, creeping realization that somehow and impossibly the boy was right. He would go back tomorrow, because for the first time in 3 years he needed to believe. The millionaire's pain and the boy's secret. Richard didn't sleep that night. He sat by the window of his vast, silent mansion, staring out at the garden where snow covered the roses his wife once tended. The fireplace crackled faintly, but its warmth couldn't touch the cold inside him. The boy's words wouldn't leave his mind. "Sir, I can make your daughter walk again." It was absurd, impossible. Yet the voice had carried something that science, money, and medicine had long lost: conviction. When dawn came, Richard was still awake, his eyes bloodshot, his thoughts tangled in disbelief and reluctant hope. By 7, he was dressed in a black wool coat, stepping into the limousine again. The driver, wary but loyal, didn't ask questions. They returned to St. Thomas Memorial, to the same spot outside the hospital gate. The boy was there, waiting, sitting cross-legged on the stone curb as if he hadn't moved all night. His candle was gone, replaced by a thin piece of bread he was sharing with a stray dog. When he saw the limousine stop, he rose without a word, dusting snow from his sleeves. "You came," he said, as though he had known Richard would. Richard studied him closely this time. The boy couldn't have been older than 14. His face was sharp, his eyes large and unblinking, eyes that looked far older than the rest of him. "What's your name?" "Aaron," the boy said simply. "Well, Arun," Richard replied, forcing authority into his voice. "You have exactly 30 seconds to tell me what game you're playing before I have security throw you out." Arun didn't move. "I don't play games, sir. I fix broken things. Not all things. Just the ones that still want to live." The words hit harder than Richard expected. He tried to hide the tremor in his hands. "You talk like a preacher," he said. "No," the boy said softly. "Preachers ask for faith. I ask for a chance." Richard hesitated. There was something unsettling about how calm the boy was. Not desperate, not manipulative, just sure. Against his better judgment, he found himself asking, "And what do you want in return for this miracle you claim you can do?" Aaron looked at him and said, "Nothing you can buy." The driver gave a nervous cough behind them. Richard frowned, irritated but intrigued. "You know who I am?" he asked. The boy nodded. "Everyone does. You're the man who can build anything except a happy home." Richard's face went cold. "You've got nerve, boy." "I've got truth," Arun said, meeting his gaze. It was the first time in years someone had spoken to Richard like that. No fear, no reverence, no agenda. Just blunt honesty from a child who had nothing to lose. After a long pause, Richard exhaled heavily. "Fine, you want a chance? You'll get one. But if you so much as try to trick me, I won't," the boy interrupted. "But first take me to her. To your daughter." When Richard brought Aaron into the hospital, the staff whispered. A billionaire in a tailored suit walking beside a barefoot boy with torn clothes looked almost surreal. Nurse Rachel, who had cared for Emily since the accident, shot him a questioning look. "Mr. Hensley, is everything all right? Just give us privacy," he said curtly. Inside Emily's room, the air smelled of antiseptic and faint lavender. Machines beeped softly beside the girl lying still on the bed. Her golden hair brushed neatly across the pillow. Her eyes opened when she heard the door. "Dad," she murmured, her voice thin. "Yes, sweetheart," Richard said gently, walking to her bedside. "There's someone I want you to meet." Emily turned her head and saw Aaron standing quietly by the door. Her brow furrowed. "Who's that?" "A friend," Richard lied. "He says he can help you." Emily's lips curved into a tired half-smile. "Another doctor?" "No," Arun said before Richard could answer. "Not a doctor. Just someone who wants to try." The girl blinked, amused by his calmness. "You? You're just a kid." "Sometimes," Aaron said softly. "Kids see things adults forget to believe in." Richard felt something twist inside him, a blend of shame and hope. Emily stared at Aaron for a moment, then sighed. "All right then, magic boy. Go ahead and try. You can't break what's already broken." Aaron stepped closer, his small hands trembling slightly as he reached toward her leg, the one that hadn't moved in years. His fingertips brushed her ankle for barely a second, then he drew back. "Not today," he murmured. She's not ready yet. Her heart still believes she can't. Emily frowned, confused. What are you talking about? Aaron looked at Richard instead. You promised her she'd walk again, didn't you? But you don't believe it anymore. She feels that. The words sliced through him. Richard opened his mouth, but nothing came out. The boy continued, his tone softer now. Miracles don't start in the legs, sir. They start in the heart. That night, back at the mansion, Richard couldn't shake the feeling that the boy had seen straight through him. He poured another drink, but it didn't dull the unease. Later, his assistant called. Sir, I did a quick background check on that boy. No records. No school, no guardians. But he's been seen sleeping near the old clinic you ordered demolished 10 years ago. The one where that doctor died in the fire. Richard's hand froze mid-air. The phone slipped slightly in his grip. What did you say? Sir, the name he gave. Harun. There's no birth certificate, but an old report lists a missing child. Son of Dr. Arjun Mehta. For a moment, the room tilted. That name, Mehta, was one Richard had buried deep. The doctor who had fought to save patients when Richard's construction company bought the land for development. The man who died when the demolition team moved too soon. He sank into his chair, the firelight flickering over his face. What are you doing here, boy? He whispered to the empty room. Outside, the wind howled against the glass like laughter or maybe warning, as the shadows stretched long and cold across the floor. The unlikely bond, the next morning, sunlight spilled through the tall windows of Emily's hospital room, painting the sterile white walls in soft gold. For the first time in months, Richard had come early, restless, sleepless, unsure of what he was even hoping to see. The boy was already there, sitting beside Emily's bed, humming a tune so faint it blended with the hum of the machines. She watched him with mild curiosity, a small frown on her lips. You came back, she said, her voice half playful, half defensive. You really think you can fix me? Aaron didn't answer immediately. He looked up at her, eyes filled with that same unsettling calm. Not fix, heal, there's a difference. Emily raised an eyebrow. You sound like one of Dad's life coaches. Richard almost smiled from the corner of the room, but the smile didn't last long. Aaron turned and said without looking, They teach your father how to pretend he's okay. I don't teach pretending. The silence that followed was sharp enough to cut glass. Emily's eyes widened slightly. Richard's throat tightened. He didn't know how the boy could read him so effortlessly, as if he had been inside the walls of their lives long before they met. Let him try, Richard finally said. If it helps even a little, it's worth it. Emily sighed and nodded. All right, mystery boy. Let's see what miracle you've got. Aaron began with gentle exercises, moving Emily's legs, pressing her feet, adjusting her breathing. His touch was careful, almost reverent, as if he wasn't just touching her body, but something deeper. Her fear, her despair. Emily winced at first, her muscles stiff and cold from years of stillness. But after several minutes, she stopped protesting. Feel that? He asked quietly. She shook her head. Nothing. That's okay, Aaron said. We'll start where you feel nothing and teach it how to remember. Richard watched, unable to understand what the boy was doing. No machines. No professional therapy equipment, just calm hands and strange focus. Yet the air in the room felt heavier, charged. Even the rhythmic beeping of the monitors seemed to slow in sync with the boy's movements. After a while, Emily fell asleep, her breathing deep and peaceful. Arun covered her gently with a blanket and turned to leave. Where did you learn this? Richard asked quietly. The boy hesitated at the door. From someone who healed others, until people like you took his place away. The words struck like lightning. Richard stood frozen, his mind already connecting invisible threads. Your father, he whispered almost to himself. Aaron didn't confirm, but his silence was enough. Then he said, I don't want revenge, sir. I just want her to walk again. Maybe if I do that, my father's soul will rest. And he was gone before Richard could say another word. Over the next week, something began to change. Emily started smiling again. Her tone, once sharp and bitter, softened. She looked forward to the boy's visits, to his odd stories about stray dogs he fed, to the herbs he mixed into teas, to the strange breathing patterns he taught her that made her chest ache but her mind feel lighter. One evening, she whispered, I think I felt something today, just a tiny spark in my toes. Richard almost didn't believe it until he saw her trying to move them again, determination burning through her fragile frame. The doctors were baffled. "It's impossible," one said, shaking his head. The damage to her spine was irreversible, but Aaron only smiled. "Maybe the spine was fine," he said. Maybe it was her hope that was paralyzed. Richard didn't know whether to be grateful or terrified. One night, while waiting in the hallway outside her room, he saw Aaron asleep on one of the benches, his hands clasped around a small silver locket. Curiosity got the better of him. When the boy stirred and dropped it, Richard caught it before it hit the floor. Inside was a faded photograph, a man with kind eyes and a gentle smile, standing in front of a small clinic sign, Dr. Arjun Mehta, Holistic Medicine and Rehabilitation. Richard's chest tightened. The very same clinic his construction crew had bulldozed 12 years ago. The one whose owner had refused to sell until the very last moment. The man he had branded as stubborn and unrealistic. He remembered the fire that followed the demolition, the news reports calling it an accident. He remembered signing the compensation papers coldly, rushing to a board meeting afterward without a second thought. Now the man's son was here, quietly saving his own daughter's life. The next morning, Richard tried to confront him, but Aaron avoided him with the ease of a boy who'd already made peace with the truth. Instead, he spent his time with Emily, laughing, teasing her into trying to move more. During one session, Emily's leg jerked slightly, a faint but visible twitch. Her gasp filled the room. "Dad, did you see that?" Richard rushed forward, eyes wide, but Aaron didn't look surprised. He only smiled. "Told you," he whispered. "Your body remembers everything, even how to heal." Tears filled Richard's eyes as Emily clutched his hand, laughing and crying at once. For the first time in years, hope felt real. But later that night, as Richard stood by the hospital window, watching the snow fall, a thought chilled him to the bone. If this boy truly was Dr. Mehta's son, then every act of kindness he offered carried a silent shadow of something deeper. Maybe this wasn't just about healing. Maybe it was about redemption, or worse. Maybe it was about balance, because miracles, Richard realized, always come with a price. The hidden past revealed, the night the truth came for Richard Hensley, it didn't knock. It stormed in like judgment. Rain lashed against the mansion's glass walls and thunder crawled across the sky like a living thing. He sat in his study, staring at the glowing screen of his laptop. On it was a name he hadn't seen in 12 years, Dr. Arjun Mehta. The search results pulled up old newspaper articles, the ones he had buried with money and silence. Local clinic destroyed in accidental fire. 1 dead, 1 missing. The words blurred under his eyes, but the photo was unmistakable. That gentle, smiling face from Aaron's locket. Richard leaned back in his chair, breathing hard. Every memory from that time came crashing back. The protests, the desperate man who had begged him for 1 more week to relocate his patients, and his own cold reply, "Business doesn't wait for sentiment. Doctor." He remembered signing the demolition order despite warnings that the site wasn't fully cleared. Hours later, fire. 1 man dead, no survivors confirmed. But there had been a survivor. A small boy who vanished into the streets with nothing but his father's name and grief. The door creaked. His butler Martin stepped in hesitantly. "Sir, it's about the boy. I thought you should see this." He handed over a thin file, damp from the rain. Inside were recent police reports, missing child cases, medical records, and a photo clipped at the back. A younger Aaron, about 7, standing beside his father, the same bright eyes, the same gentle defiance. But there was something else, an injury report. Smoke inhalation, partial nerve damage to lungs, high risk of chronic failure if untreated. Richard's throat went dry. The boy had been sick all along, dying quietly while saving his daughter. He slammed the folder shut, unable to breathe. The room spun with guilt, realization, and something he couldn't name. Fear. Because if Arun had known who he was, then this entire miracle was built on the ashes of revenge or redemption. At dawn, he went back to the hospital, determined to confront the truth. The hallways were dim and empty, the kind of quiet that feels like it's waiting for something to happen. Emily was still asleep, her hand resting on her chest, her breathing calm. Aaron was sitting beside her, whispering softly under his breath, his fingers gently tracing her palm as though writing invisible words on her skin. Richard stepped inside. Enough secrets, Aaron. I know who you are. The boy looked up slowly. There was no fear, no surprise. Only a quiet sadness. Then you know what you took from me. Richard's voice cracked. I didn't know the fire would happen. I never meant— Intent doesn't erase consequence, Aaron interrupted, his tone calm, almost too calm. You didn't light the fire, but you built the walls that trapped him inside. The words hit like stones. Richard staggered back a step. You came here to punish me, didn't you? This was all revenge. Aaron stood, his frail body outlined by the faint morning light. If I wanted revenge, I'd have let your daughter die in that hospital bed. But I couldn't. My father taught me that healing one soul can sometimes free another. Richard's eyes burned. Why help me? Aaron looked toward Emily, sleeping peacefully. Because you're not the only one who lost family that night. A heavy silence filled the room. Then, as if sensing the tension, Emily stirred, her eyes fluttering open. Dad, what's wrong? Richard turned away quickly, forcing a smile. Nothing, sweetheart. Just a misunderstanding. But his voice trembled. Emily looked between them, confusion knitting her brows. Aaron, what's happening? Aaron knelt beside her. Nothing bad. You just keep getting better. That's all that matters now. He touched her hand and she smiled faintly, unaware that tears were forming in both their eyes. Later that day, Richard drove back to the ruins of the old district where the clinic once stood. The city had built new towers over it, but a single cracked wall still remained, half buried in dust and weeds. On it, barely visible under the grime, were the faded words, "Healing is the only real wealth." He stood there for a long time, the rain soaking his expensive coat until his knees gave out and he fell to the mud. For the first time in decades, Richard Hensley wept, not for business losses or ruined deals, but for a man he had never truly known, and a boy who should have hated him, yet came to heal his child. That night he returned to the hospital determined to make things right. But when he entered Emily's room, the bed was empty. Panic struck his chest like a knife. Where is she? He barked. Nurse Rachel rushed in. Mr. Hensley, please, she's fine. The boy took her to the therapy garden. He said she needed fresh air. Richard ran through the corridors, his shoes echoing off the tiles. He burst through the garden doors and froze. Emily was standing, leaning slightly on Arun's shoulder, her legs trembling but real, her face lit by pure disbelief. Dad, I can feel the ground, she cried, tears spilling down her cheeks. I can feel it. Richard's vision blurred. He moved forward slowly, afraid that if he blinked, the miracle would vanish. But Aaron looked pale, sweat glistening on his forehead, his breathing shallow. She'll walk, sir, he whispered. But there's something you must do. Richard grabbed his arm. Anything? Name it, Aaron smiled faintly. Tell the truth to her, to everyone. Before Richard could answer, Arun collapsed, his body hitting the ground with a dull thud. Emily screamed. The doctors rushed in, chaos erupting around them. Richard knelt beside the boy, his voice breaking. Don't you dare die on me, not now, not after this. But Arun only looked up with half-open eyes and whispered, he'd be proud of you, if you finally did the right thing. Then his eyelids fluttered shut as the rain outside began to fall harder, pounding the glass like the sound of distant applause, or mourning. Redemption and tragedy. The hospital lights flickered that night as if the building itself could feel the weight of what had happened. Outside, thunder rolled again, deep and endless, shaking the windows. Inside the ICU, machines hummed softly around a small, motionless figure, Aaron. His chest rose and fell unevenly, his face pale, his thin hands resting on the blanket like paper. Richard stood by the glass, frozen. He hadn't moved in hours. He had watched doctors rush in, watched them attach tubes and monitors, watched life itself fight to stay inside a boy who had already given more than he had to give. Emily sat in a wheelchair nearby, wrapped in a blanket. Her face was streaked with tears. Dad, she whispered hoarsely, he saved me. He made me feel again. Richard turned toward her, his face drawn, eyes hollow. I know, sweetheart. He's the reason you're alive. The reason you can stand. Emily's voice trembled. Then why does it feel like he's dying because of me? Richard knelt beside her, his hand gripping hers tightly. Because of me, not you. She looked at him, confusion clouding her face. What are you saying? He hesitated, his throat tightening. How could he tell her the truth? That the boy who had healed her was the son of the man whose life he had destroyed. But Arun's last words echoed in his mind. Tell the truth. To her, to everyone. He took a shaky breath. There's something you need to know about Aaron. And about what I did years ago. As he spoke, the world outside seemed to fade. The sound of the rain became distant, replaced by the slow, steady rhythm of confession. He told her everything. About the land deal, the clinic, Dr. Mehta's death, and the boy who had vanished into the flames. He spoke of greed, ambition, and the hollow empire he'd built on someone else's loss. Emily's eyes widened with horror and disbelief. You mean Aaron's father died because of you? He nodded, tears breaking free. Because of my choices, yes. I destroyed his father's work, his home, his life, and he still came back to save you. Emily turned away, pressing her trembling hands to her face. How could he forgive that? How could you let it happen? I didn't know, Emily, he said, voice cracking. I didn't see the cost back then. I thought success was all that mattered. But now I know I'd give everything I have just to undo that one act. Silence. Then slowly, Emily looked up, her eyes red but fierce. Then you need to make it right, Dad, not with words. With truth. Her voice had the same quiet strength as her mother's once had. The same kind that forced Richard to face himself. He stood, his reflection in the glass now a stranger. Not a titan of business. Not a billionaire. But a man stripped bare before the weight of his sins. I will, he whispered. For him. For both of you. The next morning, the world woke to headlines that made jaws drop. Billionaire Richard Hensley admits to cover-up in fatal demolition fire. Hensley pledges entire fortune to build free hospitals under victim's name. At the press conference, cameras flashed as Richard stepped up to the podium. His hands trembled as he unfolded a sheet of paper, but his voice was steady. 12 years ago, he began. A man named Dr. Arjun Mehta died because of my greed. His son survived, orphaned, and forgotten, until fate brought him back into my life. That boy healed my daughter when no one else could. His name is Arjun Mehta, and he reminded me that true wealth is not in power but in mercy. The room went silent. Some reporters lowered their cameras. Others wiped their eyes. I can't change the past, Richard continued, but I can honor it. Starting today, I'm establishing the Arjun Mehta Foundation, dedicated to providing free medical care to children who cannot afford it. This is not charity. It's justice delayed, Mo, but finally justice served. The crowd erupted into applause, but Richard didn't smile. His gaze drifted to the front row where Emily sat, tears on her cheeks, and the empty chair beside her, the one he had reserved for a boy who might never wake up to see this day. That evening, Richard returned to the hospital. The hallways were dim and quiet again, the way they always were after visiting hours. Aaron's room smelled faintly of antiseptic and lavender. The machine still beeped softly, but the sound had changed. Slower, weaker. Emily sat beside the bed, holding Arun's hand, whispering to him through tears. Please, you can't go now. You promised you'd walk with me in the garden when I could. Richard stepped forward slowly. He can hear you, he said softly. Keep talking to him. She nodded, gripping the boy's hand tighter. You showed me how to believe again. So now you listen. You don't get to leave without seeing it, okay? A faint movement. Just a flicker of his eyelids. Then his lips parted ever so slightly. Walk, he breathed. Walk for those who can't. His pulse monitor spiked, then began to fall. Doctors rushed in, shouting orders. Emily screamed his name. Richard was shoved back as nurses surrounded the bed, their voices rising in urgency. Code Blue! Get the crash cart! Richard pressed his hand to the glass, watching helplessly as they fought to bring the boy back. He had faced boardroom wars, legal battles, financial disasters, but nothing had ever made him feel this powerless. Then came the flat line. A single endless tone that silenced everything else. Emily's sobs broke the air. Richard turned away, tears spilling freely down his face. Outside, dawn began to break, pale light cutting through the storm clouds, but the world felt darker than ever. He whispered into the silence. You gave me my daughter back. And I couldn't even give you life. The miracle beyond walking. 3 days after the heart monitor fell silent, the mansion that once echoed with emptiness was filled with quiet mourning. No press, no cameras, no noise. Just the soft whisper of wind through the open windows and the faint scent of candles burning for the boy who had saved a life and changed another. The doctors had called it heart failure from chronic respiratory damage, but Richard knew better. Aaron hadn't died from illness. He had given away the last of his strength to complete his purpose. Emily hadn't spoken much since that night. She sat by the window in her wheelchair, staring at the snow-covered garden. But that morning, without warning, she stood, slowly, shakily, but with resolve burning in every trembling step. Richard froze as he saw her move, not out of joy this time, but disbelief mixed with awe. Her eyes glistened with tears, but her voice was steady.
"He kept his promise, Dad. I told him I'd walk for those who can't." Richard's throat closed.
He reached for her hand, and together they stood in the golden hush of morning. For the first time, he didn't see her as broken. He saw her as the living echo of everything the boy had stood for: compassion, courage, and forgiveness. That afternoon, they buried Aaron beneath an old oak tree in the hospital's memorial garden. Only a few people attended: the nurses, Emily, Richard, and a handful of children from the orphanage nearby. The boy had requested, before his final collapse, that no grand monument be built, only a simple marker with his name and a single sentence engraved beneath it. He healed others so they could heal the world. As the last handful of soil fell over the small coffin, Emily whispered, "You gave me legs, Aaron, but more than that, you gave me purpose." Richard didn't speak. He couldn't. Every word felt too small for the enormity of what this boy had done. Weeks passed. Life began to move again, quietly, reverently. The Arjun Mehta Foundation became a reality faster than anyone expected. Hospitals and clinics opened across cities, funded entirely by Richard's fortune. The name Hensley was no longer printed in corporate headlines, but in stories of free surgeries, children walking again, and medical students volunteering under the foundation's banner. But Richard himself had changed. He no longer wore his expensive suits or attended board meetings. He spent most of his days visiting the clinics, sometimes sweeping floors, sometimes sitting beside recovering patients, listening more than talking. One winter morning, Emily walked beside him through one of the new children's rehabilitation centers. The halls were alive with laughter, little feet tapping against polished floors, wheels of walkers squeaking in rhythm. At the far end of the corridor stood a mural freshly painted, Aaron holding out his hand toward a child, the sun rising behind him. Emily stopped in front of it, her eyes soft. "He would have loved this," she murmured. Richard nodded, his voice quiet. "He's still here in every step these kids take." As they turned to leave, a small boy came running up to them, holding something in his hands. "Sir, miss, look what I found near the statue outside." It was an old tattered shawl, Aaron's shawl, folded neatly, impossibly clean despite the mud and rain of the past weeks. Inside it lay a piece of paper, brittle and yellowed at the edges. Richard unfolded it slowly. It was a letter, written in uneven handwriting that was unmistakably Aaron's. "If you're reading this, I'm free. Don't cry for me, sir. I didn't lose my life. I gave it back to where it belonged. My father once said that true healing isn't when a body moves, but when a heart forgives. You gave me that gift before I left. Tell Emily to keep walking, not to reach somewhere, but to carry someone. Every step she takes is a prayer for the ones who can't." The paper trembled in Richard's hands. He couldn't hold back the tears anymore. Emily rested her head against his shoulder as the words sank deep into their souls. "He knew," she whispered. "He knew you'd come back to who you were meant to be." Richard's voice broke. He knew everything, and still chose kindness. Years passed. The world moved on, but the Arjun Mehta Foundation became a symbol of human goodness reborn from guilt. Children across countries walked because of one boy who had nothing but heart. On a quiet spring morning many years later, an elderly Richard sat on a park bench beneath the same tree where he'd first met the beggar boy. His hair was silver now, his body frail, but his eyes were gentler than they had ever been. The city had built a bronze statue there, not because Richard ordered it, but because the people demanded it. The statue showed a boy with a small candle in his hand, shielding it from the wind. A group of school children passed by, one asking curiously, "Who was he, Grandpa?" Richard smiled faintly. "He was the richest man I ever met, and he didn't own a thing." He looked up at the sky, the clouds breaking apart to let the sunlight spill over the statue's face. In that golden light, for a fleeting instant, he saw Aaron standing there, smiling, calm, whole. Tears blurred his vision as he whispered, "You made my daughter walk again, Aaron. But you made me live again." He closed his eyes, the breeze brushing softly against his face like a final blessing. And for the first time since that night 12 years ago, his heart was light. Because in a world that worshipped money and power, one barefoot boy had proven that the greatest miracle of all was not walking again, but learning how to stand for others.